Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is The Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, Taiwan is a beacon of democracy in Asia and an important counterbalance against the Chinese regime. We talk about how Canada can better support Taiwan.
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
Welcome to the Andrew Lawton Show. This is a special edition of the program. On the weekend programs, what we do is do a deep dive into some very critical issues that oftentimes don't get nearly the attention they deserve. And one of the issues I want to spotlight on this episode is the state of Taiwan, but more specifically, Taiwan-Canadian relations. Taiwan is a beacon of democracy in a part of the world that very much needs it. It's also a country that has been excluded from very key international organizations, notably, as we've seen in the last year and a half, the World Health Organization, despite Taiwan having one of the best records in the world of any nation in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. We have continued threats of aggression from China. As recently as a few days ago, the Chinese regime saying that it wants to pursue at all costs the reunification. And here we are with a Canadian position that is not entirely clear in supporting Taiwan. We have a fantastic panel of guests here to delve into this issue, and we'll see where the discussion goes. I'm joined by St. Albert Edmonton Member of Parliament Michael Cooper, who introduced the Canada-Taiwan Relations Framework Act, which would have pursued a very strong relationship between Canada and Taiwan that I know we'll get to during the discussion. Also, Yuehying Tseng, who is a founder of Taiwan Watch, a freelance translator now with a great passion for Canada-Taiwan relations and also Taiwan's relationships around the world. And York University professor Jung-Chin Shen, who is an expert on Taiwan-Canada affairs and joins us now as well. All of you, thank you so much for coming on today. It's great to speak with you.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Thank you.
So I want to start with you on this, Michael, from the political side of this. How would you characterize right now the Canadian government's approach to Taiwan? And I guess a better part of that question is, what should it be in your view?
The approach of the current government has been, frankly, timid. For the longest time, the Prime Minister hadn't even uttered the word Taiwan. Indeed, it was when I posed a question to him at the start of COVID back in January of 2020 and pressed him on whether the government would support Taiwan's participation at the World Health Assembly. That for the first time in a long time, if not the first time ever since Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, that he answered in the affirmative. And just recently, when Taiwan applied to join the CPTPP, the government of Canada didn't indicate its support for Taiwan. So there's a lot that Canada should be doing to stand up with Taiwan on a diplomatic basis in terms of strengthening economic relations and encouraging greater defense cooperation and working with our allies.
I want to move to you on this next, Yuehying, because I know you look at not only Canada's relationship with Taiwan, but also that of other countries. I mentioned in my introduction the issues with the World Health Organization, which I think has certainly been it's been very revealing of a sentiment that exists elsewhere. But would you say it's getting better? Would you say more countries are coming alongside with this idea of recognizing Taiwan, or is it pretty stagnant?
I wouldn't say it's better, but I would sum up as the exposure of Taiwan news in the last almost 2 years has been increased dramatically and in a positive way.
And how has that been positive? I mean, why has that happened, I guess?
Mainly was because that Taiwan have been very successful in controlling the pandemic, and economic growth has been soaring better than before, which stand out of all most of the countries, and even the growth is faster than China.
Well, that's very interesting. Professor, let me turn to you on this. I know that for the most part, and you may have a different perspective on this, I would think a lot of the politicians in Western countries, in liberal democracies, are ideologically on side with Taiwan, especially as it pertains to China on the other side of this, the People's Republic of China. So what is it that prevents stronger action on this? Is it just fear of China? Is that what it comes down to?
I think it comes a couple of factors. Number one, of course, is economic factors. And China's large volume of markets and imports, which is obviously is one of the most important factors which attract most of the country toward China. But there's also other factors because China actually uses several diplomacy to lure different countries. For example, during the pandemic and vaccine diplomacy has been very successful in South America and Africa and the Middle East. And also the Road and Build Initiative, which is a project to build infrastructure across several countries, which has also been very successful to attract many countries' participation. Of course, the most recent report shows that that's a huge downside for the RBI Road and Build Initiative, which is a hidden debt, which already created more than 360 billion debt to China.
I'm glad you brought up the Belt and Road Initiative because I think the influence of this and the spread of this around the world is very much understated. And I would also say, to talk about the media angle here, unexplored significantly. Let me turn to you on this, Michael, because we know that the conservative government, the previous conservative government under Stephen Harper, really viewed free trade as being the tide that raised all boats. We saw dozens of free trade agreements with countries around the world, but at the same time, we know that despite China's entry onto the world stage into a number of these global liberal institutions, China has not liberalized. China will not liberalize. It's not moving in that direction. Instead, as we mentioned with the Belt and Road Initiative, China tends to benefit from this without really giving and without any other countries around the world benefiting. So to bring this into the Taiwan context, let me ask you here, does China need to be dealt with in that way for Taiwan to be dealt with? Do both things need to be done at the same time? Or irrespective of what's happening with China, can a country come up with a very strong pro-Taiwan policy?
Well, we need to recognize that China is not our friend. It is an important partner in many respects, but it is not our friend. And this government's approach of more or less going along and getting along with the Chinese communist regime and seeking to appease the Chinese communist regime resulted in hostage diplomacy, resulted in the Chinese communist regime threatening the safety and security of more than 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong, and has resulted in punitive trade measures imposed against Canada. So we need to work with our allies to counter China and to support a democracy in the Indo-Pacific region, which is being threatened by the Chinese communist regime. And that includes strengthening relations with Taiwan, including in areas of trade and investment. And we shouldn't minimize the importance of Taiwan to Canada. Taiwan is a big deal. It is our 13th largest trading partner. It is our 5th largest trading partner in Asia, and it is one of the world's largest economies.
That's, I think, a very interesting point, because a lot of times people view Taiwan and support for Taiwan as being an inherently anti-Chinese regime move, which, you know, in some ways it may well be. But I think you're right to point out the independent reasons that trade with Taiwan should be pursued. And this goes back to what you and I were speaking about at the beginning, Yuehying, about how people are learning more about this. They're learning more about what's happening in Taiwan. But do you find that there is, when you do your advocacy around the world and in Canada, do you find there is an understanding of what Taiwan is? Or does it seem very abstract for people? It's just this thing they hear about in the news every now and then.
In terms of understanding Taiwan and Taiwanese and the preference what Taiwanese want for their future, regarding the sovereignty and country recognition, I don't see people, ordinary people, knowing very much. Some may say they don't even showing interest about it. So in a circle of the news media, people in a group may know better. In general, no. On the other hand, lots of misinformation coming up, mainly from China. So this is countermeasure. It's not, the effort has not been there, and countries that are receiving the negative impact from China when they have stretched their relations with Taiwan a bit better, in any way that may anger in China. So the negative impact they receive, in another way, it's a lesson to teach the public. That's a taboo area. No, don't go. So no.
That's interesting, and I guess, Professor, I'll ask you, why should people care? What's the message to those who don't necessarily understand the impact of Taiwan or why it matters? Why is this a region that needs to be given attention and a country that needs to be supported?
I think there are a couple of reasons that people probably want to pay attention to it. The number one is that it actually helped Canada's economy. The first thing is, if you see in Canada, over the past 2 decades, our manufacturing sectors already declined almost like 50%, and which had a huge impact. For example, our blue-collar workers, most of them, they don't have job now. And a lot of manufacturing decline, it's not just a cycling. A lot of jobs permanently move out of Canada, and which also affect Canadians' innovation. Because a lot of innovation, if you want to commercialize, you require cooperation between R&D and manufacturing. The truth is, Canada's exporting now, most of them based on resource-based. On the other side, Taiwan has probably one of the best manufacturing, especially in terms of high-end semiconductors. So from this perspective, I see that's a huge complementarity between Canada and Taiwan. And number two is Taiwan and Canada actually share a lot of things in common. Everyone knows that Taiwan is on the first line on confronting with China. So a lot of misinformation and a lot of propaganda and from China to go to Taiwan. And as we all know that China's influence into Canada's business, politics, and economy has been huge. And I think Canada has a lot to learn from Taiwan, how in a small island can have such strong power and know how to deal with China's different economy and information strategies.
There's an interesting issue that you raised there, which is the like-minded nature of Canada's relationship with Taiwan. And I'll go back to you on this, Michael, because we know the Conservative government, or the Conservative Party rather, ran in the last election on the idea of Kanzuk. And there was a push behind that Canada should pursue relationships with similar countries, in that case, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. Is that where things are going now, where countries should start prioritizing values and similarities and shared concerns in pursuing relations? And do you agree with the professor here that Canada and Taiwan would fit that?
Yes, we certainly do. We share common values, commitment to freedom, democracy, pluralism, and the rule of law. And yes, it is important that Canada conduct its foreign relations on the basis of common values. And we need to confront the Chinese Communist regime and work with like-minded allies, including the United Kingdom, Australia, the United States, India, and Japan. Because right now, having illegally but nonetheless successfully annexed Hong Kong, Taiwan is in the crosshairs of the Chinese Communist regime. Indeed, John Aquino, the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, stated earlier this year that the annexation of Taiwan is the Chinese Communist regime's #1 priority. And there's no question that the increased aggression that we have seen is a real threat, not only to stability and peace in the Indo-Pacific region, but also to the international rules-based order. And we've got to work with our allies to confront that and deal with it.
I'm glad you brought up Hong Kong, and I have a question for you about that, Yuehying. When we see what we've seen in the last year, and I guess the last couple of years in Hong Kong, does that force a lot of the people in your community, the activists for Taiwan's independence, to get a little bit nervous, or is that really underscoring why it's so important to continue that fight for independence?
Not only in the activists in the forum that I am in, also the opposition party currently in Taiwan politics, quite a field of little smaller parties that are even more convinced that there is no any gray area in terms of the preference to choose the future for Taiwan independently, or to go along softening with China. I think the main opposition party, Kuomintang KMT, has been receiving less approval rate, and the rating is dropping down. One of the reasons that coming from what's happening in Hong Kong, and the result, the loss in general elections, President re-elected from DPP party beginning of last year.
I'll put the same question to you, Professor. What, if anything, is there to take away from the Hong Kong experience that could help, or I mean, if we're being analytical about this, hurt the Taiwan independence movement?
China has been promoted a one country, two system and to Hong Kong, and want to use it as an example and then to reunify Taiwan. However, and as we have seen since 2017, China basically completely violated the agreement with the United Kingdom and completely destroyed freedom and partially democracy and in Hong Kong. So it turns out that Hong Kong as an example for reunification between China and Taiwan has completely lost the credibility. So I think it's very important to let the world know what's happening and what happened in Hong Kong, which deliver one, I think, very important message to the free world, which is you should never trust CCP's commitment, even in papers. So, and if you remember, like the Deng Xiaoping ever promised that 50 years we'll maintain the same system in Hong Kong, but after Xi Jinping become the leader, and then they completed and forget the commitment. So I guess that nowadays, especially in Western, the so-called Panda scholars and the schools, they kind of want to base on Western values. They want to believe that everyone will honor the contract. Once we reach agreement with China, and then we can draw China into the world trade system, eventually we can change China's political regimes. This idea has been proven completely wrong over the past 50 years.
wish I could disagree with you, Professor, but I really can't. I mean, the historic record speaks for itself there. And I'll turn to you, Michael, because not trusting the Chinese Communist Party has been something that Canadians in particular have been reminded of why they shouldn't do for the last several months, the last year and a half. Just recently, we had the return of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor after China had engaged in hostage diplomacy over Canada's arrest of Meng Wanzhou. But when we look at this, there's been for the last however long this pandemic has been going on, 18 months or so, there's been this sense that, well, we can't criticize China's handling of the pandemic because we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to be aggressive when they have the two Michaels. And a lot of those same themes are still going to be there now. Well, we can't be aggressive with Taiwan or aggressive with China about its position on Taiwan because, they could arrest some Canadians. They could lash out in other ways. What do you respond to people who say that with? Because I think there is a legitimate concern that any strong position against China will result in that sort of conduct, which we've seen from them in the past.
I think in some respects, it's the wrong lesson to take away, that somehow we can't rock the boat and that we should go along and get along with the Chinese Communist regime. As I outlined earlier, the strategy simply hasn't worked. And so I think it's just the wrong approach to take.
What would, just to take a broader look at the Canada-China relationship, which includes Taiwan but has other factors as well, what would that relationship look like if you had your way?
In terms of the Canada-Taiwan relationship?
Well, the Canada-China relationship more broadly, which I'm just pointing out here, includes Taiwan but also has other things.
Yeah. Well, as I say, I think we have to recognize that China is a serious threat. This is a dangerous regime. It is a regime that is committing genocide right now as we speak. And so the measures that I would like to see Canada take is to take a strong position against the Chinese Communist regime in terms of imposing Magnitsky sanctions on Chinese communist officials who are responsible for dismantling democracy in Hong Kong. The US, for example, has imposed such sanctions on 34 individuals, including Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam. That would be an important step to send a clear message to the Chinese Communist regime to think twice about doing to Taiwan what it has done to Hong Kong. We need to get Huawei out of Canada's 5G network. The telecoms are already moving away from Huawei, but for some reason this Liberal government hasn't seen fit to do that. So there's a lot of measures that we can take and should take to stand up to the Chinese Communist regime's bullying and the fact that they are not just a threat to Taiwan, but in many respects they're a security threat to Canada.
Yuehying, what do you think of that position, that their countries have a vested interest, Canada and other nations around the world have a vested interest in taking a strong position on China, which would help Taiwan, but would also help themselves? Do you agree with that?
Certainly, yes. China's testing your boundary all the time. So relationship with Taiwan in terms of trade and diplomatic relations is solely dependent on the country itself, on Canada itself. And China should stay out of the business of Canada. And it's a very fine line, and Canada certainly needs to learn to navigate the way out. And Canada has not been the first country going through the last 2 years of the two Michaels detention. Therefore, Trudeau government has been really silent and on the issues and delaying with the actions to voice for human rights issue and democracy issue in Hong Kong, human rights issue in Xinjiang, and issues with Taiwan in general. We now comes to a turning point now. Hopefully that will be a turning point to a positive way. And we will see what the Liberal government's going to bring to us.
Do you find, Professor, that China's bad behavior tends to immunize it from a lot of pushback? Because as we were talking about in the last few moments, a lot of people will say, well, yeah, we don't like that China's doing X in Taiwan or Y with the two Michaels, but, well, we don't want them to do more of it, so we're not going to say anything about it.
China's market to many countries in the world still one very important factors to influence their foreign policies. But in addition to that, if you look at the reality, actually China doesn't have many allies around the world. And given the current situation between the United States and China, I think it's very important for Canada to stand on a free country side. And then we should unite all the like-minded countries and then to work together. And one of the most important things, I guess, would be like Mr. Cooper ever introduced the Canada-Taiwan Relations Framework Act. Of course, because of election, it had been stopped, but it would be much appreciated if Mr. Cooper can bring back. And another thing, I guess, which is also important is about CPTPP. And I guess Canada can work to welcome Taiwan to join CPTPP and to form a trade zone which allow the like-minded country to trade with each other and without worrying too much. And lastly, that is important is the alliance between United States, United Kingdom, and Australia to form AUKUS and a few weeks ago. And of course, I understand that Canada, we didn't join that. But given the Indo-Pacific region probably will become the most controversial region around the world. And I think Canada need to be prepared. We have to prepare to join the like-minded country and to deal with anything that could happen in the next few years.
When we hear discussions about aggression in the South China Sea and sanctions and all of these very big picture things, it's very abstract to a lot of ordinary people. And let me ask you, Yuehying, on this. What can ordinary people do? What can people do on an individual level to support Taiwan and support the Taiwanese pursuit of independence?
I'm working on this as well to get the people to develop the interest to get to know Taiwan. And I know Taiwan government, Taiwanese people are working on their behalf to generate the interest and in general in a positive and both win way to reintroduce Taiwan and to establish the connection between people to people. And people generally understand and agreed that Taiwan has been demoted and disregarded in terms of personal level and the country level. They feel helpless as well. When you talk about ordinary people, each of them think they are just one, how much power they can influence their government official or even speaking China. So it seems very small, but we gotta look at this way that we are a society, a community, and like working with like-minded country. So it's a small step that for an ordinary people to connect with their representative in the area and to push the party in the country to work on the actions and for the long run. And we're not only talking about favoring for Taiwan. No, we're talking about in the long run for security, for economic reason, and for the defense reason, and for the general good, that we want to have a peaceful relationship and workable relationship with China. We're talking about this. And so government need to develop a long-term strategy that we cannot back down. We could take in a slower step when things comes difficult, but where the big leap can be put forward, we have to be prepared for that. And I will prefer the countries having their bucket list of what they can do to strengthen their ties and economic trade relations with Taiwan. And also, I would also like to see how this work when China put in assault to Taiwan. If there's a possibility to play it the other way around, that we could, in terms of keeping silence, we should take a step forward to deliver our message and to reach our hand to Taiwan. Very tiny baby steps, things as few months ago when in March this year, when China banned the pineapple fruit import from Taiwan to China. I can see trade office in Taipei posting pictures of themselves buying more of and consuming more of the Taiwanese pineapples, and which is very, very unusual, I would say, in my observation. The trade office not only taken out to the social medias, and it generated the media in the circle to reporting this and to reach out the ordinary people. Yeah, but the similar things, same as the canola oil ban and beef and all the other agricultural product banned in Canada and other trade banned in Australia. So we all each suffer the same thing, same tactic from China for no reason, for unforeseeable and irregular reason, for no reason. And we should get together, and even just tiny little steps, we could still inch out to deliver a positive message that we are ready for a bigger action.
That's very well said, Yue. And I should note, when China does things like its actions on canola and the pineapple example, it makes it real for a lot of individual people, because all of a sudden you have farmers and people that work in trade and shipping that are affected by this, that start seeing that. So I'm glad you shared what you did. Let me turn back to you here, Michael. You introduced in June the Canada-Taiwan Relations Framework Act. As we know, the parliamentary session didn't last too long after that, and we ended up in an election before your bill could be advanced any further. I assume you would like to do something else in the next parliament very similar. Let me ask you also, how was that received just, casually and personally among your colleagues of different parties? Was there broad cross-partisan buy-in for this?
I'm hopeful that there will be cross-party support for what is a modest but important step. And it is an initiative that I do intend to take up in this new parliament. But very simply, the legislation that I put forward, the Canada-Taiwan Relations Framework Act, provides for a mechanism, a framework by which to conduct relations between Canada and Taiwan absent formal diplomatic relations, including in areas of cultural, legal, and economic affairs. Among the measures that it would enact is to codify Canada's support for Taiwan's participation in international fora, including at the WHO and at ICAO. It would allow the Taiwan Representative Office to be called that instead of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office, recognizing that office, that diplomatic office, represents the government of Taiwan and the people of Taiwan. It would provide that Canada could enter into legal agreements with Taiwan so that we could negotiate on an upfront basis to advance things like a foreign investment promotion, FIPA agreement, the next step towards a free trade agreement. And it would recognize in Canadian law that Taiwan is an entity, recognizing that for all intents and purposes, absent common recognition, Taiwan is effectively a sovereign state.
Very well said. And I'll give you the last word on this, Professor Shen. What would you like to see the next step be from a Canadian government or from any other government? What do you think is the first thing that should happen if we pursue the ideal relationship with Taiwan moving forward?
I think the first thing the government should do is to ban Huawei 5G. A lot of Canadians, we don't understand Chinese regimes. If you know China very well, you must understand that Huawei is not a private enterprise as it looks like. In reality, in such a sensitive industry like telecom, in China, it's impossible to have any room for private business. Huawei actually is based on military, PLC, to fund it. But most Canadians, we don't understand. I mean, like when you try to engage with China, you should not base on a common framework which we usually use in Canada. You have to really understand China's regime, and then you know how to deal with the Chinese.
Well, very well said, and we could do a whole other panel show on Huawei, which we might do, so thank you for the inspiration. York University professor and Taiwan affairs expert, Professor Jung-Chin Shen, Edmonton MP, or St. Albert Edmonton MP, I should say, Michael Cooper, and also Taiwan Watch founder Yuehying Tseng. Thank you, all three of you, for coming on. This was a thoroughly enlightening discussion. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.